Good morning. Welcome to the Church of the Holy Trinity in Juneau, Alaska, on this, the 19th Sunday after the Pentecost. We've just completed the 45th Annual Convention of the Diocese of Alaska. This year, as with so much else, the meeting was held electronically. We had two 4-hour Zoom sessions. These were held on successive Saturdays. The thing I love most about convention is the vast scope of landscape and the tremendous diversity of tradition and people that it gathers together in love and joy. I'm grateful for the hard work of the diocese, of the diocesan staff, and of our Bishop Mark team in bringing and creating a gathering that renewed and stoked that spirit of love and joy, even though it was an electronic gathering. I am grateful to the Reverend Don Allen Heron for the worship and technical teams of St. Mary's in Anchorage, for creating a setting for our liturgy that allowed me to sing and to be present as Bishop Mark celebrated the Eucharist with the whole diocese together. I believe that at the conclusion of the 8th day of our convention, God saw what had been made and it was good. Soon, we'll post a link to a recording made of the concluding service on our website. And we'll post it along with the service bulletin. And I invite you to look for that so that you may enjoy it as well. Last week, Louise Glück was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. In celebration, here are the opening verses of her poem, Averno. When you die, your spirit dies, otherwise you live. You may not do a good job of it, but you go on, something you have no choice about. I find this to be a reassuring poem in these strange times when so much seems to be unraveling and politics has frayed to the point of embarrassment. It's a wonderful poem. I hope you'll read it. I'll read the penultimate verse. It's this. Nature, it turns out, isn't like us. It doesn't have a warehouse of memory. The field doesn't become afraid of matches with young girls. It doesn't remember furrows either. It gets killed off, it gets burned, and a year later it's alive again, as though nothing unusual has occurred. In these strange times, it's reassuring that a treasury of words lives among us. Words from recent years and words from long ago. The word spoken at the very beginning still lives among us. It's the living word. It speaks clearly and magnificently to us of new life and joy, even when the meaning of it all is obscure. It leads us on our walk on the way of love, the unusual path of Jesus. Consider, for instance, the gospel appointed for today, which is from the 22nd chapter of Matthew, the first 14 verses. This is a parable, one which also appears in Luke's gospel. It's called the Great Supper or the marriage feast. Now, it tells a disturbing story. It's about a time when all the guests invited to a dinner party refused at the last minute to come. In Luke's recollection, the host then gathers the lost and the lone and the lame, everyone in the neighborhood and on the roads to enjoy the feast. Matthew takes things in a bit different direction. Instead of a fancy dinner party in a man's house, he says, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. Now, in the middle of the story, between the place where they refused to come in Luke and the gathering of new guests, there is a second refusal in Matthew and a war. And at the end of the story, one of the many guests who's been coerced to come in from the street by the king's servants is found by the king to be improperly dressed. And the king commands, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness where he and they will have weeping and gnashing of teeth. Parts of our tradition have long described this as Matthew's allegorical telling of salvation history. In that interpretation, the king is God, and the son is Jesus, and the first prophets of Israel are sent to the excuse makers. And Matthew's Jewish opponents are the second group, and this leads up to the destruction of the Second Temple. This interpretation may have been Matthew's intention, although he may just as well have been referring to the chapter of Isaiah, chapter 5, which concerns the first temple's destruction and the diaspora. However that is, continuing along with Matthew's telling, when the rabble is brought in from the streets, it's often understood to be the early and still mostly Jewish Christian church. It was sorting itself out into good and bad. And at the last, in Matthew's telling, and in this interpretation, the good are the true elite. Now, what of the poor man in the wrong robe? He's often taken as an object lesson about the Last Judgment. Yet, after all, this is a parable of Jesus, told by Luke, told by Matthew, but it's one of those marvelous short stories of life in the Spirit that Jesus told that refused to be cut and sewn into too confining a fashion. As witness to this, there are three places the garment of Jesus' making does not accommodate the fit of this understanding. To many and I, now and through the ages, the middle part of the story is most jarring. This is the part in Matthew where the king sent other slaves, saying, tell those who've been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. Now, it's not the liberties that Matthew takes with this passage in the passage of time and the ephemeral nature of banquet food. That's readily enough accepted as just a part of the fabulous landscape. No, the jarring is in the reaction of the king, who is supposed to be a metaphor for God. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Now, in some circles, people will say, yeah, that's the wrathful Old Testament God for you. That's why we like Jesus. He wouldn't do that. About this, my old friend Trent would say, that dog don't hunt. The God of the Hebrew Bible is the God of the Trinity, is Jesus, who walks the way of love. If anything has changed with respect to God's anger, it must be our changed understanding. So let's look a little bit more closely at the text. I find two more reasons to reconsider this allegorical interpretation. And the first reason is in the initial statement. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. And the second reason is found in the final statement. For many are called, but few are chosen. It goes like this. What sort of wedding is it that has no bride and no bridesmaids or bridal relatives? None of these are even mentioned. Some would say that the bride of the Son is the church, but without any relationships given in the parable, nor any antecedents provided, or anything at all of reference in the story to the bride, this wedding is more like an abduction than a consensual agreement. And with such a beginning in the story, the later violence should not be a surprise. So perhaps the comparison which Jesus invites in that opening sentence is one of contrast. Compare and contrast the kingdom of heaven with such violence. I recently came across words attributed to Democritus, a Greek philosopher of the 5th century BC. The violence of war is the father of all and the king of all, he says. Father of all and king of all. From before Democritus' day to our own, the secular world is organized and sustained according to the principles of force and violence. So this parable reads well as an examination of the role of shame in governments of dominance. Governments led by rulers who are strong men. Strong men. The wedding is a metaphor for political alliance, which in the absence of love or even personal recognition of a bride or of any other sign of respect, this represents complete domination. Take another look at the king. This is a man burning for recognition. And yet he is so unpopular that none of those he invites from abroad will join him. And no wonder they will not, for they may be compelled to become the unnamed bride. Yet to refuse him is dangerous. When the tyrant's insistence is resisted, violence erupts, and in his rage, not only the guilty are punished, but it escalates to total destruction of the nation. And even after this military victory, no one will humor him. So the great man then turns upon his own people. Then he said to his slaves, "The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy." He burns, you see, he burns with humiliation at the slight. And he can't admit it, so that the others become not worthy. "Go, therefore," he says, "into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet." So those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. The one objective of the king's staff is to give the great man an overflowing audience. And what of that solitary person, the man bound and cast into the outer darkness, the one who was speechless? Well, perhaps once again, Matthew's recalling Isaiah, this time chapter 53, especially verse 7. "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." This is from the songs called the Suffering Servant songs of Isaiah. Now, the parable has changed. It has become a comment on our own times. It's not a promise of promotion for the elite at end times, but the heroine of this time. Matthew writes at the end of the parable, "For many are called, but few are chosen." You see, if the bound man is thrown out for punishment at end times, we have a paradox in the interpretation, a problem, because the bound man is the few, and the many are in the banquet. The chosen one has died and risen and lives again among us, calling us from among the fearful and the shame dead into new life. The people cry out for justice. The gates of death lie shattered, and the king of lies turns to dust in the strong light of morning. In these strange times, the living word, spoken at the very beginning, speaks clearly and magnificently of new life and joy. Paul writes to the Philippians, "Rejoice, let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. The Lord is near. Even while the meaning of our times may be obscure to us, we are led in our walk along the way of love, which is the unusual path of Jesus. You may not feel you do a good job of it, but you go on. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.